The Perfect Catastrophe Introduction. Ignacio Ramonet. He has been a Spanish journalist, professor of communication theory established in France and one of the main figures of the alternative world movement. The Perfect Catastrophe. Introduction. The earthquakes that shook stock markets and banks during the Black Septembers and Octobers of 2008 precipitated the end of an era of capitalism. The international financial system was shaken like never before. Worse than in 1929. There were those who claimed that the world had passed a millimeter from the abyss, a millimeter from the economic atomic explosion. It was fake. It had not passed by a millimeter, it had directly plunged into the most terrible of systemic crises. And the apocalypse is far from over. The crisis has turned into a global recession, deflation is a threat, and very likely the world will headed for a new Great Depression. With its painful procession of social destruction. The state and politics are back. In all corners of the world, governments are relocating to the front lines. They resume their function as leading actors in the economic field, nationalize financial establishments, carry out liquidity injections, multiply reactivation plans. In short, they replace the defective market. Even international geopolitics is in turmoil. In the United States, the crisis has already given rise to the unthinkable, the election of Barack H. Obama, an African American, to the presidency. But the task of the new president will not be easy. Because the Bush era marked the apogee of the world hegemony of the United States, and because, ultimately, this hyperpower has been short-lived and ineffective. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated that military supremacy does not automatically translate into political victories. The collapse of the Soviet Union led the United States to define universal political objectives in an apparently unipolar world. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, now admits, but those objectives were more of a slogan than strategic feasibility. The financial crisis will force all major countries to re-examine their relationship with Washington. The United States will have to relinquish its role as self-proclaimed guardian and test the limits of its hegemony. In addition, the rise of China and India suggests that the days of the United States as the world's leading economic power are numbered. In other words, Barack Obama will have to manage, in the midst of the most serious economic crisis in the last 100 years, the new decadence of his country. Which will be very dangerous, because the reactions of a wounded lion are always unpredictable, and because history shows that there is nothing good in waiting for crises, they more surely give birth to Hitlers or Stalins than Gandhis. It is difficult to expect that the economic depression will improve the lot of the half of humanity that shares less than 1% of the world's wealth. Outbursts of anger and violence are expected in the south of the planet, whose repercussions will not escape the rich countries of the north. The crisis also provides an ideal pretext for productivist industrialists to delay the implementation of measures aimed at reducing greenhouse gases, which will accelerate climate change, with its negative consequences. Perhaps this crash does not mean the end of capitalism, which has already known others and has managed to recover. But it does signal the end of the deregulated economy, the culmination of an era, that of ultraliberalism, mafia capitalism and financial globalization, whose main victims, in developed countries, are the middle classes and workers. As if this were not enough, they are going to pay with their taxes and savings for the recovery plans of a banking system stimulated by speculation and now gone mad. And whose final blow was given on December 11, 2008 with the arrest in New York of Bernard Madoff, a legendary broker, implicated for 50 years in a gigantic pyramid fraud estimated at some 37,500 million euros. Many people feel that the state he abandons her while saving guilty bankers and rewards them with scandalous golden parachutes. This sense of injustice is already unleashing massive fury, the like of which has not been seen for a long time. Is it by chance that on December 6, 2008, Greek youth took to the streets of major cities shouting bullets for the youth / money for the banks, protesting against the death of a teenager killed by police forces? In this country hit hard by the current crisis, where, as in other states of the European Union, Privatizations hit public sector workers, where civil servants are victims of drastic budget cuts, where the university, the pension system and health are threatened by privatization, and where wages remain frozen. For the angry young Greeks expressed their weariness with an economic and social model that a teacher denounced in these terms: "We are fed up with the deterioration of our lives." Since this same model is working in the rest of the European Union, can we rule out reproducing the protests in other countries? The national sentiment in the United States, explains Moises Naim, director of Foreign Policy magazine, is one of lynching the Wall Street thieves and rejecting to the immigrants who take our jobs, the multinationals who export our jobs to India, the rich who pay little in taxes. The crisis will be long. There will be immense social suffering, which must not be in vain. Therefore, it should not waste this opportunity, but rather take advantage of the impact to finally change an unequal and obsolete international economic system and development model, and refound them on fairer, more supportive, and more democratic bases. A revolution. The collapse of Wall Street and its planetary domino effect can be compared, in the financial sphere, with what the fall of the Berlin Wall meant for the geopolitical field: a change of world and a Copernican turn. This debacle represents for capitalism what the fall of the USSR was for communism. The essayist Emmanuel Todd confirms this: "We are experiencing a collapse of ultraliberalism comparable to that of the communist model 20 years ago." Economist Emanuel Wallerstein is more pessimistic. "We have entered the terminal phase of the capitalist system. What differentiates this phase from the uninterrupted succession of previous conjunctural cycles is that capitalism no longer manages to form a system, in the sense in which Ilya Prigozhin, 1917-2003, understands it. When a system, biological, chemical or social, deviates too much and too often from its situation of stability, it will no longer be able to regain balance, and we then witness a bifurcation. The situation becomes chaotic, uncontrollable for the forces that dominated it until then. And we see that a struggle arises, no longer between the champions and the adversaries of the system, but between all the actors to determine what will replace it. Well, we are in crisis. Capitalism comes to an end. In short, it is not just a crisis, it is a revolution. It is enough to see how on Wall Street, in the sacred temple of capitalism, the main economic dogma of the last decades, that is, the almost religious power of the market, is today questioned. The top gurus of the financial pantheon, usually tireless worshippers of the deregulated market, drop to their knees, bend their backs, renounce their ancient faith and implore the state to forgive their sins and come to their aid. Today everyone converts en masse to the theses, until yesterday considered heretical or archaic, of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, a supporter of state intervention to stimulate the economy. Not without hypocrisy, some boo tax havens, vilify the ability of hedge funds and condemn the disproportionate income of bankers and agents. Now the model of the countries that chose Keynesianism and maintained some form of economic regulation is claimed. From South Korea to China, including India, observes Christian Chavignoux, the economic achievements of the last decades were the product of countries that escaped the liberal consensus. 9 And although the impact of the crisis will be felt throughout the planet, it is probable that the economies where the action of the state has been placed at the service of development will fare better. In the case of Latin America, it is worth noting the interest of mechanisms such as the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, ALBA, the Bank of the South, the creation by the ALBA countries, brought together by Ecuador, of the Sucre Stabilization Fund and Reserves, unique regional compensation system, or the idea of a bank of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, proposed by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. A frightening memory. Will the spectacular rescue plans adopted in Europe and the United States succeed in stopping the slide of capitalism into the abyss? Henry Paulson himself, U.S. Secretary of State for the Treasury during the last Bush administration and creator of a spectacular recovery plan of more than 500,000 million euros, questions this. Despite the magnitude of our intervention, he said, other financial institutions are going to go bankrupt. Some analysts also do not rule out a black scenario, where central banks would fail to revive global demand. This would be the case if the credit markets remained locked up or if the US Federal Reserve was no longer able to lower its rates. Economic historians have not, of course, forgotten the terrible Wall Street crash of 1929 and the mother of all crises that it unleashed. But above all, they keep in mind the most recent memory of the Japanese rampant crash of the 1990s, caused by the bursting of the real estate and financial speculative bubbles. Phenomenon that caused a white decade for the Japanese economy. Similar to what we see with the current financial crisis, the Japanese crash of the 1990s triggered a fearsome vicious circle, a credit crunch, followed by bankruptcies and real estate sales, which in turn contributed to lower prices. With the consequent cascade of chain reactions, industrial production collapsed, domestic demand collapsed, the number of bankruptcies multiplied and the number of unemployed exploded. An ambitious recovery plan, announced in July 1998 by Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi, reached the sum of 400,000 million euros destined to recapitalize the banks and buy doubtful loans from them. Without major success, 7 banks ended up being nationalized, 61 closed, and 28 were forced to merge. The deflationary spiral hit the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Nikkei index plummeted and real estate prices fell by 70%. It is estimated that the losses of real estate and stock assets between 1990 and 1997 were around 7 billion euros, corresponding to 24 points of Japanese GDP, that is, more than 2 years of growth. A nightmare whose memory makes governments tremble today of the world. Even more so when, in a recent study of the 127 economic crises that have occurred in some 30 countries over the last 30 years, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, confirms that those arising from the real estate and banking sectors are particularly intense, long, profound, and harmful to the real economy. In a few weeks, after the financial hurricanes of September and October 2008, the effects of the Great Wall Street crash had reached the 5 continents. The Reykjavik Stock Exchange lost 94% of its value, those of Moscow and Bucharest, 72%, that of Shanghai, 69%, those of Athens and Bombay, 50%, that of Sao Paulo, 45%, and that of Johannesburg, 40%. In January 2008, the accumulated value of 8 major stock exchanges, New York, Tokyo, London, Frankfurt, Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels, and Lisbon, reached 23.5 billion euros. 10 months later, it had shrunk in half. The crash had wiped out, at one time, around 14 billion euros, that is, more than 5 times the GDP of France. 14 on a planetary scale, around 20 billion euros disappeared, the equivalent of 10 years of French growth. In several countries, in a few days, currencies plummeted. The Indian rupee lost 10% of its value, the Mexican peso, 14%, the Polish zloty, 22%, and the Brazilian real, 30%. And other countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, the Czech Republic, experienced similar pressure on their currencies. During the crisis, and at the risk of amplifying it, speculators targeted the weakest states, attacking their currencies and continuing to enrich themselves, like scavengers at the expense of their prey. Iceland is bankrupt. Other European countries, such as Ukraine and Hungary, had to resort to IMF aid, as many first world states had done in previous decades. Losses linked to rotten real estate loans, subprimes, in the United States are estimated at more than 1 trillion euros. And the US authorities, in an attempt to save their financial system, had already disbursed, by mid-November 2008, more than 1.5 billion euros, an amount greater than what they had allocated, since 2001, to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the world's big banks also need hundreds of billions of euros. Which led them to restrict credit to companies and families, with disastrous consequences for economic activity. Towards a social nightmare? Where the crisis hits hardest is in the real estate sector. In the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Spain, for example, millions of flats and houses no longer find a buyer. Home prices are down. Those of the buildable land too. The increase in real estate loans, as well as fears of a recession, plunge the entire sector into a hellish spiral, which has devastating effects on the entire construction industry. All companies in this branch are in the eye of the hurricane. Thousands of jobs are destroyed. Thus, the financial crisis is transformed into a social crisis, causing the resurgence of authoritarian policies. Several European governments, for example, already proclaim their willingness to favor the return to their countries of thousands of foreign workers, relying on the Return Directive, voted by the European Parliament on June 18, 2008. In Washington, the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, officially in charge of dating the beginning and end of economic cycles, announced, on December 1, 2008, that the economic recession had begun a year earlier, that is, already since December 2007. Result, in November 2008, the United States saw a 10-month uninterrupted decline in employment, something it had not seen for 34 years. In that same month of November 2008, it was learned that the number of unemployed had increased by 673,000 people, something not seen in the last 15 years. These announcements led to a new nightmarish session on the New York Stock Exchange, the worst since the crash of 1987, and the Dow Jones Index sank 7.33% to fall to its lowest level in the last 5 years and alarmed the stock market agents. We can observe, declared one of them, an absolute disorientation in the markets. Unemployment hit 6.7% of the population, that is, the highest level since 1983. In the financial sector alone, 200,000 jobs were eliminated from Wall Street, 17, of which 53,000 belong to Citigroup. In France, at the beginning of December 2008, as the country was preparing to enter a recession, unemployment was rising and the number of unemployed was once again above the 2 million line. The UNEDIC, a body that administers unemployment insurance, calculated that if growth contracted by 1% in 2009, there would be 162,000 more unemployed. Poverty also worsened. On the eve of the holidays in late December 2008, nearly 800,000 people compared to 700,000 in 2007 were forced to turn to associations that work with food banks for food. In Spain, a country whose economy based on real estate construction and tourism had not stopped growing in the last 15 years, the statistics recorded, in October 2008, the greatest increase in the number of unemployed in its history, that is to say, 192,000 more in just 1 month. And 171,200 the following month. The total number of unemployed Spaniards then reached 3 million, 37.5% more than on the same date in 2007. Analysts from the Union of Swiss Banks, UBS, announced that in 2009 the number of Spanish unemployed would reach 4 million, 16% of the active population. Developed countries and the European Union among them that have resorted to financial innovation to guarantee sky-high returns to investors and huge salaries to bankers are the ones that have been hit the hardest. The IMF calculates that in 2009 the economy of these states will experience the lowest growth of the last 27 years. The coming economic depression, warns Ronald Cohen, a financier close to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, is going to have the same magnitude as the well that the economy has struggled to climb for 15 years. Few sectors will emerge unscathed. Unemployment and property foreclosures affect millions of people, causing social explosions all over the world. That is why European leaders closely followed the Greek protests of December 2008. They saw there a warning that could be reproduced in other countries with the arrival of new waves of poverty generated by the crisis. They do not ignore that protest and looting are usually proletarian responses to the decline in purchasing power. The world is heading towards its worst economic and social nightmare. A crisis that spreads to the world. The shock waves from the impact of the crash also reach the southern states. The most fragile populations in developing countries are fully affected. In 2008, due to rising food prices, the number of chronically hungry people jumped, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, from 840 to 963 million. Meanwhile, in rich countries, the greatest concern is focused above all on how to supply the 800 million vehicles that travel the world's routes. The United Nations warned that, because of the crisis, developed states threaten to drastically reduce the 76,000 million euros dedicated to development aid, which will have dramatic consequences in terms of food, medical assistance, and education for millions of people. According to the IMF, due to the crisis, many countries in the South are also experiencing liquidity problems because foreign investors are repatriating private capital and foreign banks are reducing their lines of credit. After the G20 summit, on November 15, 2008 in Washington, the Brazilian Minister of Economy, Guido Mantega, declared, "As this crisis becomes more critical, it has consequences in developing countries. When there is no longer liquidity, investment funds withdraw their money from these countries to cover the gaps in the United States and Europe." In China, for the first time in more than a decade, the growth rate fell below the 10% level. In the Guangzhou region alone, thanks to the sudden drop in exports, 9,000 out of 45,000 factories closed during the last quarter of 2008. Nationwide, more than 20 million people lost their jobs and around 70,000 businesses went bankrupt. 24 Faced with the unexpected magnitude of the disaster, the authorities announced, on November 10, 2008, a gigantic recovery plan, more than 450,000 million euros, in order to stimulate the internal market and give dynamism back to a falling growth-free. The effects of the crash are being felt even in Latin America, where the early application of Keynesian policies, particularly in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, had made it possible to restore growth. In Brazil, for example, the fall in the real, the decline in exports and the drop in commodity prices threatened to bring down growth, which in 2009 could be cut in half to around 3%. On November 7, 2008, Argentina, also affected, announced the renationalization of the private-funded pension system, imposed in the 1990s by ultra-liberal governments. Due to the collapse of the stock markets, the amount of pensions for retirees in that country, but also in Chile, Bolivia, Uruguay, Peru, and Mexico, had been drastically reduced in just 2 months. After having contributed a lifetime, millions of retirees found themselves cheated, dispossessed, with miserable pensions. We are promoting this measure at a time of international crisis, where the main countries that are part of the G8 come out to protect their banks. Instead, we decided to protect our retirees and workers, said President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. To save the banks, the heads of state of the richest countries were able to organize several summits in a few months and mobilize more than 2.3 billion euros. But what was done to save the half of humanity that lives in poverty? Practically nothing. However, according to the United Nations, with a sum 50 times smaller, it would be possible to supply drinking water, a balanced diet, health services, and elementary education to every inhabitant of our planet. How long will the crisis last? 20 years if we're lucky, or less than 10 if the authorities act consistently, forecasts Financial Times editorialist Martin Wolf. Too pessimistic? What is certain is that this crisis will be long and will not spare Europe or the rest of the world. The Perfect Catastrophe Introduction. Ignacio Ramonet.